Hello Year 11 and welcome to today's lesson. Today we're going to do a quick recap of the Renaissance element of the medicine course. So the Renaissance is a term we give to the social and cultural changes that were happening in Europe between 1500 and 1700. Now you've probably heard of big names in the Renaissance such as Leonardo da Vinci, whose Vitruvian Man we can see here. So the Renaissance marked a moment of change in medical ideas. Why did this happen? Well, it's a range of different reasons. Firstly, in 1500 we get lots of religious change, and one of these religious changes that happens is the rise of humanism. Humanist scholars included Erasmus and Thomas More. They were characterised by a love of learning and a new interest in classical scholars, so the ancient Greeks and Romans. And they believed that human beings could make up their own minds when it came to discovering the truth of the world around them. So it's about being a bit more open to challenging old authorities, particularly the authority of the church. Secondly, we get new technologies in this period, particularly the printing press. Now, the printing press is crucial because it helps to break the church's control of ideas. Now, previously, all books had been made in monasteries, written out by monks, and so the church controlled what ideas would be spread. Because you now had printing presses, that control was broken, and new ideas could be circulated widely and cheaply. This meant new ideas could be much more popular. Other new technologies included the first microscopes, which allowed them to see bacteria for the first time. They didn't call it bacteria or understand its role in disease. They called it animalcules, but they did notice it there. And we've got lots of publications of new textbooks and much better anatomical drawings that were accurate because the rise of Renaissance art as well. As mentioned earlier, this period saw lots of religious changes. It's the period of the Reformation of Henry VIII and stuff. And so the church was increasingly challenged, and it no longer had its stranglehold on all knowledge and power. And there was also the rise of civil society and things like the Royal Society, which was trying to spread enlightenment, rationality, and the new science. So all of these things were driving a change in ideas in this period. Let's have a look at what those ideas were then. Firstly, causes of disease. Now, I've just said a lot about change, but these look quite similar to the medieval period, don't they? They believed that God caused disease, miasma caused disease, the supernatural, witches, and the planets might cause disease. And to some extent, they still believed in humoral treatments, that the humours caused disease. This became increasingly unpopular throughout the period, but it kind of morphed into an idea that you're not covered by your humours, but by your constitution. So it's still sort of lurking there in the background. So what kind of treatments did they have? Well, again, a lot of these are very similar to the medieval period. We've got religious treatments, such as prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage. Supernatural treatments, such as charms, spells, and amulets. Humoral kind of treatments, like bloodletting, purging, bathing, using natural herbs and remedies. But we also get some new things. So herbal remedies changed quite a bit in this period because of the discovery of the New World, of the Americas, which had lots of different new herbs in it that were brought back and thought to be good for different remedies. For example, tobacco. We also have a new understanding of transference. This idea that an illness could be transferred to an animal or an object. So if I don't feel very well, if I slap a onion beside my boil, maybe my boil will seep into the onion instead of me. And this period also saw the rise of chemistry, particularly like alchemy. So there were lots of kind of new scientists trying to discover gold and things. And they were trying to provide new chemical cures for disease. So instead of just using herbal remedies, maybe this new chemistry could provide cures as well. The prevention of disease similarly looks fairly similar to the medieval period. We've got religious forms of prevention, such as prayer, confession, giving money to the church. We've still got the idea of the regimen sanitatis, an idea that goes back to ancient Rome. There was also this idea of moderation, not doing anything in excess. So eating, but not eating too much. Doing some exercise, but not too much. There was a focus on cleanliness, both at home, having a cleanly home, but also the body being free of bad odours, so being clean. There were also new instruments like barometers and thermometers, which were used to measure the atmosphere and the weather, because there was an increasing idea that the weather and the atmosphere was having some effect on what kind of diseases were occurring and when they spread. Now that does kind of make sense, because if we think about COVID, it spreads more in winter and goes away in the summer. And there was also a focus on cleanliness in a more kind of community-wide setting, having the government ensure that the streets were cleaned and fining those who didn't clean the streets outside their houses. Treatments of disease. Well, who carried them out? Again, this looks similar to the medieval period. We have educated physicians, apothecaries who work like Renaissance pharmacists, barbers, surgeons who'd be the ones who are actually doing some forms of minor surgery, for example, pulling teeth or maybe removing small lumps and bumps, that sort of thing. However, hospitals were changing quite a lot in this period. Previously, hospitals had often been associated with the church, placed in things like monasteries. But of course, the dissolution of the monasteries and the religious changes meant that hospitals changed as well. There were fewer hospitals, and they were increasingly funded by charities, by charitable sponsors. It's not just the way they were run that was changing, though. What they were doing to their patients also changed. Increasingly, people weren't going so much for rest and relaxation, hospitality, like they had been in the medieval period. They were going to be cured. Patient records show that many people went to hospital with wounds and curable diseases, such as fevers and skin conditions. They didn't actually spend very long in hospital, which suggests they are being treated and getting better. A new form of hospital also emerged, the pest house or plague houses or pox houses. These were places specifically for those with infectious diseases. People were increasingly aware that you could pass diseases from person to person, so those who were infectious weren't allowed into normal hospitals, and so they went instead to these pest houses. However, just like in the medieval period, the vast majority of medical care came from the community, probably from women, mothers, wives, aunts, local wise women, people who had knowledge that was passed down to them from generations. They were able to give advice and mix up herbal remedies and that sort of thing. particularly, there is the case study of Lady Grace Mildmay, who was a rich and well-born lady who kept detailed notes of the healing and treatment she did. In this period, we also get a number of key individuals who are important in bringing about change in medicine. And one of these individuals is Thomas Sydenham. Now, Sydenham is around in the 1600s, around 1640s, 1660s. He is a very well-respected London lawyer, and he was important in moving medicine towards a more kind of scientific method. So he was increasingly challenging the ancient classical ideas of Galen and bringing in things that we would have thought, yeah, of course you do that. He, for example, increasingly challenged the reliance on medical textbooks, instead said that it was crucial that you observe the patient in your diagnosis. And he brought a scientific eye to the study of disease. So plants and animals had begun to be classified, working out like phylum, species, that sort of thing. And he started doing the same to diseases, realising that some diseases were kind of related. He also realised that disease appears in the same way in every person. So everybody should be treated the same way for the same disease. Now that was different from the medieval period, where they had focused on like the birthday and the astrology and things like that of, oh, well, he got sick under Saturn, so he needs this kind of treatment, whereas she got sick under Jupiter, so this is what happens. He said it's the same disease, treat them in the same way. And because of this scientific approach to diseases, he did manage to identify that measles and scarlet fever were different diseases. His contribution to medicine means he's now known as the English Hippocrates. Andreas Vesalius is our next important key individual. Now, he was a Dutch anatomist, so interested in anatomy, in how the body works. Now, in the medieval period, dissections had been forbidden because it was because it was believed that you needed the body intact in order to rise up on Judgment Day. However, Vesalius was allowed to carry out dissections, and then he wrote up his findings in famous work. For example, his 6 anatomical tables, or his On the Fabric of the Human Body. Now, these were important works because they actually got the body right this time. He realised that Galen and those who'd come before him had made lots of anatomical mistakes because they hadn't been working on humans, they'd been working on monkeys, for instance, pigs. In fact, he managed to find that there were over 300 mistakes in the work of Galen, and he set about correcting them. And he made these incredible detailed drawings, illustrations to his work that were really important in teaching doctors what the body actually looked like, what it did. He encouraged doctors to dissect and not just rely on books. Now, because it's the Renaissance, his work was able to take advantage of the great Renaissance artists who were fabulous at drawing, and he was able to use the printing press to spread these ideas further. So he's got his famous works, but they also would have had fugitive sheets, which were cheaper single printed sheets that students could use to learn better anatomy. Finally, Our last key individual is William Harvey. Now, Harvey is around a little earlier. He's around in the court of James I, so the early 1600s, and he's British. So he was a physician and an anatomy lecturer at the College of Physicians. And he was really interested in the circulatory system. His most important discovery was that the heart pumps blood around the body. Now, his idea was based on his observation on dissecting lizards in order to look at their heart, which pumps slower because they're cold-blooded animals. So through this experimentation, he realised that lots of the things that Galen was teaching about the circulation were incorrect. For example, Galen believed the liver made blood, and he believed that your liver would make 1,800 litres of blood a day for a person to survive. His ideas were also inspired by some of the new technology at the time. For example, they'd just come up with firefighting pumps. So that idea of pumping water around helped inspire his understanding of the circulatory system. Harvey's work was then promoted, spread by his connection to the Royal Society. So it was important that we had this scientific organisation to spread work and let others know about it. Now we're going to start looking at some key disease case studies. And the first one is syphilis. Now, syphilis at the time was known as the Great Pox. It came probably from the New World with Christopher Columbus, and it's basically an STD that causes sores, fever, tumour, abscesses. Eventually, you might go insane from syphilis. So it's quite nasty. It was seen as a punishment from God for sin, which just kind of makes sense given that it's an STD. It had no cure. There was no effective cure anyway, but doctors tried lots of different remedies, including herbal remedies from the New World, such as guaiacol wood from the West Indies, chemical cures, like using mercury, and humoral cures, like trying to sweat the syphilis out. Now, syphilis is a bit of a weird one because it was associated with bathhouses. That's because bathhouses were sometimes also brothels. And the rise of syphilis led to a decline in the popularity of bathing in this period. So actually, people potentially getting a bit stinkier because of syphilis. Our next case study is the Great Plague. Okay, so the Great Plague hits in 1666, and it has a massive effect on England. There are 7,000 deaths a week in September, and 1 in 5 Londoners died. Now, there are lots of similarities between the Great Plague and the Black Death of 1348. Lots of their causes are extremely similar. Many believe that the Great Plague was caused by God, God being angry about the sins of the world. There was a belief it was caused by miasma, bad airs, and there was a belief it was caused by astrology, unusual positions of Mars and Saturn. But there was also an increasing understanding that it was passed from person to person. The treatments are also quite similar. You've got religious treatments, confessing your sins, prayer, fasting, and herbal remedies, poultices, medicines, rubs. We also have some new treatments coming in. Things like transference, placing a chicken on a bubo so that the Great Plague transfers from the bubo to the chicken. getting wrapped up in thick woolen cloths and laid by a fire to sweat out the disease. And you had the rise of the quack doctor, who was providing all kinds of weird remedies, kind of herbal remedies really, in order to cure you of the Great Plague. Of course, the best thing to do was just not to get the plague. So there were lots of different kinds of prevention. We've got religious prevention, prayer, pilgrimage, fasting. In fact, Charles II ordered the entire country to fast in this period. We also get strong smelling herbs, carrying round pomanders, these bags of herbs. And again with the strong smelling stuff, diets of smelly things, like a diet that's got lots of garlic and sage within it. Perhaps you'd smoke tobacco to ward off the miasma. Well, this is a very weird one. Catching syphilis. It was believed because syphilis had the sores that were similar to the sores of the Great Plague, that if you caught one, you wouldn't catch the other. So people going out deliberately and getting syphilis in order not to get the Great Plague. Plague doctors, of course, are famous from this period. We all know the image of a plague doctor. Here's one. Now, this famous special costume is there because they believed that the kind of bird-like shape would attract disease. And so it's thought the disease might be attracted to the bird shape and leave the patient. But also that mask is stuffed full of sweet-smelling herbs to ward off the miasma. And the cloak is treated with wax so that none of the pus or blood from the patient soaks into it. So you can just wipe it off. We also get quarantining in this period. So famously, infected households were quarantined for 40 days and a red cross was painted on the door. Now the government took a larger role in this quarantine, which meant it was more successful than in 1348. For example, the government appointed searchers and wardens to check on infected households and make sure that nobody was leaving them. They also sent round people to collect the dead. Plays, fairs, meetings, all of those kind of big events, similar to today really, were banned so that you wouldn't have people mixing. The government also ordered that streets and alleyways be cleaned and that sweet smelling herbs would be burnt in the streets, again to get rid of the miasma. And finally, that cats, dogs and pigeons would be killed. Of course, ironically, it's probably made it worse, as then the rats, who were the ones who carried the fleas that carried the disease, would then have no predators. So the rat population would explode. Of course, those at the very top of society fled. For example, the king left London. Everyone tried to get out of the capital city. So this takes us to the end of our Renaissance recap. Hopefully that was helpful. Can you now complete the Show My Homework quizzes and the knowledge organiser on the Renaissance period?